Just a little get together for the title I have, March of the Penguins, the evil Imperial March of Star Wars. For those who know Star Wars, today Microsoft is no longer a foe of the Xnix world or vice versa. We can find in many places of the Azure environment implementations on an open source level and a Linux level. This is a little bit what this talk is about. I'm going to show you where all the open source developers, whether it's with Docker, whether it's with Linux, whether it's just plain old Java or Apache, all the open source tooling that you know and that you probably are using, because elsewhere you wouldn't be here in this session, where you can benefit from Azure as a developer or even as infrastructure person. Was this the expectation that you had from this talk, or were there other expectations? I know it's after lunch, but I expect a little bit more interaction from my crowd, to be honest. So, was this a little bit the setting that you had in mind? Okay, good. All right. So, if you're lucky, we just survive for the next 45 minutes, and elsewhere, well, we'll see where we get from there. For those who haven't been in my sessions the last day and a half, my name is Mike Martin. I'm a little bit on the weather now for the moment. A little bit of stomach thing going on. So if I'm feeling a little bit less energetic than yesterday, it's normal. I try to beef up the talk, but I'll see where I can take it from here. So I'm an Azure MVP. I am also an Azure user group lead, also for the Global Azure Bootcamp. If you're interested in that, it's still possible. And most of the time I talk about Azure from an architectural perspective. I guide customers into the world of Azure, even those who are nowadays looking at Azure from an open source perspective. I don't have a strong background in open source, naming that I not actively am developing in the open source, but I have a Unix System V background from the past. So it's not that I have no experience at all, but just for showing you what the capabilities are in this world. First, let's take a look what the Azure Beast, as we all know, you've probably seen this slide many times yesterday, today, over the past 2 years. The number of services that Microsoft provides and that you can use, we are talking more than 250 plus services. That's a lot, right? But a lot of these services actually are running instances of open source or using open source technologies to make sure that they can give them to you. The best examples were at first HD Insight, which was an implementation of Hadoop, which is a technology for map reducing based on technologies built by Facebook and Google. Right, and they were all built on Apache models, and from there out they developed an enterprise environment where you can do number crunching. Microsoft implemented that on both a Windows environment because they recreated it themselves from the source, but also from a clean environment on Linux, and they can offer that both now in Linux and Windows environments. There's a couple of more there. There's new last week, no, it's already 2 weeks ago, I think, Ignite. Yeah, 2 weeks ago at Ignite they finally gave the general availability of Linux web apps, which is running, which can either run containers. We have the Kubernetes in the container services. I will talk a little bit about those. You can have, and we have already a long time full support on Linux virtual machines in multiple SKUs. So there's a little bit of everything everywhere inside of this vast and huge world we call Azure. Yeah. As you can see, also from a management perspective or a development perspective, there's still a lot of things that Microsoft can allow you to do. They even have tooling that they can implement in their own tools, like in Visual Studio Code, which I will demonstrate shortly. they have, if you're doing Java development, they have for IntelliJ, they have plugins that they created to manage your Azure instances and so on and so on and so on. As you can see, nowadays we also they also provide SQL Server on Linux. Who's SQL Server people here? Nobody, no database people. Well, partially. If you take a look, the effort that they made there to port or to recreate a SQL Server on Linux, well, the performance is amazingly fast, and I wouldn't be surprised, but this is just a guess. I mean, as an MVP, I have some insight, but this is just a guess. I wouldn't be surprised that from tomorrow or next year they say, well, we actually are now going to offer you managed instances, SQL Server that managed instances on Azure, on the Linux. There's already templates for that, but for VMs, but a managed instance is a database as a service which you can just use full 100% power of your database environment. As you know, an Azure SQL database is not 100% compliant with a on-premise SQL database. There's some things missing like CLR, support agents and stuff like that. But with a managed instance, you have everything like that, but it's managed really as a service. So it's no longer a real VM. And I wouldn't be surprised if tomorrow they say we're going to give an on-par version of managed instances on Linux. But that's just a guess. All right, don't pinpoint me on that, but it would make sense, right? Even from a management perspective, we have things like Chef and Puppet, but there's also a couple of new kits on the block. There's this thing called Terraform, for those who have been looking at that. And it actually comes with full support out of the box, even inside of the portal itself. Because Linux is also, or Bash shells or open source shells are also very well integrated now in what we call the portal. There we have a cloud shell there which you can use, and you can just implement your scripting that you do on the AZ client. You can now do that from the portal itself, so that way you can easily just import your scripts and run them from the portal itself without having to install the tools on your machine. Not that it is a big hassle, but for you it will be easier because they will automatically update all these tools and you don't have to look at it, and you just connect to the cloud storage and you can work from there. Even from a DevOps perspective, there's a good integration with a tool called Jenkins, for those who are doing Jenkins, but other build and deployment engines actually also support the Unix and the Azure environments. Now for Jenkins, I know for a fact that Microsoft is doing a lot of effort there. They already have ARM templates which allow you to deploy a full Jenkins farm. Sorry, I just have a little pain there. They already have an ARM template which allows you to deploy a full Jenkins farm out of the box with all the bells and horns. I don't know how you say that in English. Toeters and bellen. Yeah, it's, as a Belgian, I can speak Dutch to you guys. And allowing you to integrate that easily with the rest of your environment. Yeah, that's about it. Of course, anything else, like for development point of view, Xamarin is no longer real open sourcing because that's Microsoft now. There's still support for devices there. Things like Redis Cache, which came from the open source, is also now a real service that you can use. So there's really a lot of things that are open source and they're fully supported. Most of the developers probably have some Docker instances running either on Linux or on Windows. You don't care anymore because they are supported in both ways, and most of the languages are supported too. So let's start with something they announced newly, and that is the web apps on Linux. And it actually exists in a dual flavor. So is anybody here using web apps today? All right, yeah, a lot of people, good. And then do you know all the deep sides of the belly of the beast? I mean, are you using it just like from the portal? Are you using the client tools? Are you using Kudu integration? You are, okay. But you were in my session yesterday too, right? My monitoring talk, were you there too? Your face looks familiar, so don't take it as an insult, but it's just you're right in my eyesight, and there's not too many people in the room, so that makes it easy to talk. But if you're doing web apps, you need something like Kudu, and where the deployment engine is real Git, um, and this is fully supported there too. So you can just have a normal website, but in this case, it will be running on Linux. Yeah? And the instead of a command line or a PowerShell command line, you will have a full Bash console, and you can actually see that it will be an Apache that is running in all the open source technologies that you have. It supports all the nice modern environments today, like PHP, Ruby, .NET Core, or Node.js. If that doesn't cover your needs, well, you can still go around it and use it by implementing the container areas and bring your own containers and just push them into containers and make your app work like that. That's the way that cookie crumbles. I think there will probably be a larger support. Don't forget the first versions that we have of that we got from Microsoft from web apps also didn't support all the languages in the beginning, but I think we will see support for Java there too, probably some Nginx support from the web server support, and so on and so on. So that's already something very, very nice to look forward to. Upside of the containers, it's very fast. You can deploy in like seconds, and it scales like hell. I mean, containers are very easily to scale. The provisioning time for a container is like peanuts, taken into consideration with a VM that can take up to 8 minutes. So you really gain some benefit from that. Okay. So, and you can easily implement that in your development stream, because most of the build agents or most of the build servers today can easily deploy through means of a container. So the only thing that you need to do is create your image and just push it from there. Just for those who don't know what Docker is, yeah, it's not a jeans. We used to have this brand. I don't think, does it still exist, Dockers? I think it still exists, but it was a sub-brand of Levi's a couple of years ago. No, that's not it. It's about containers, the one that you use to ship stuff with. And every single time I talk about containers, especially are there IT pros here in the room? Or all devs? Okay. If I say to you, what is a container? How do you see that? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. And with what would you compare it then? With what would you compare a container then? If for the technology that you know. Okay. That was the thing that I wanted to hear. So you did good. You didn't give a great explanation, but you did good. Yeah, but the thing is, if you as a developer, and that's a pro tip, if you're explaining containers to an IT pro, and I'm not saying that you got it wrong, but you should not compare to a VM. You should compare to something completely else and compare to a stream bubble. Technologies like AppV or Citrix come to mind. That's more on the container side. And as you explained it very nicely, you actually create a bubble where you inject your application, which can run independently of your underlying host operating system. So you don't have an injection of, let's say, a Java version into your host name in your host environment. You only have that in your container, so that way you can run multiple versions next to each other. For those who know AppV, that was during the days, that was the way of shipping multiple .NET versions separately and shipping multiple browsers separately. So just to give you an idea. Why that container story? Well, it's easy. Devs love containers. I have a word of caution there, except for the implementation that they've done here. By default, containers are pretty cool. It's hip, I know, and everybody loves new stuff and technologies. It exists already for quite some time. But if you're doing containers in a production environment, be aware that containers underneath each other can talk to each other. See where I'm going? So if you're doing containers in production, especially I'm looking now at you. No, don't take this as an insult, but if you're doing containers in a production environment and you're creating multi-tenant environments or multi-tenant subscriptions or something, then you need to make sure that data will stay segregated for legal aspects or even from a security point of view. So what you need to do is make sure that if you're deploying containers, except for in this case, but if you're deploying containers, make sure that they're also hardened. And that's the hardest part most of the time when you're doing a full DevOps stack. I had this discussion with two guys from Sweden last year, where I did a talk on containers and the take on Nano and Azure and where the link is between those. And they said, oh, we're doing that in production. And boy, you are right. We had such a nightmare hardening our system that we actually gave up and went back to normal VMs. So Docker is aware of that, and other environments too, and they are working on an easier way to make sure that that can be hardened totally. Yeah, but just to give you that away, if you're doing Docker in production, make sure that you harden your environment and that you actually take care of your environment too, just like you would in a normal on-premise environment. Okay, so don't be afraid of them, but just keep that in in the back of your head. Of course, from an operations perspective, it's portable. The guys who need to support your apps don't have to do a lot of hassle. They just need to Docker run in the instance or Docker update the instance, and they're good, right? So that's basically it. So a little bit the difference on Docker terminology, the images and the containers. One is the class and the other one is the object, is the instance. That's basically it. If you compare it to development skills, that's basically it. Yeah. So the image is actually a template that you use where you can build up your software with. And the container itself is the running instance, isolated from an application perspective from sources, yes, but again, as I just mentioned, that's the impact that you can have on a segregation of duties. Looking at web app for containers, it has a built-in continuous integration, continuous deployment strategy. You can do the testing in production. You can easily swap, also just like you would do in normal web apps. It scales easily, of course. Monitoring and diagnosis, there are some facts that you can do there. Secure and compliant. In the case of the web apps, because they actually run in your own little ecosystem, if you want to do multi-tenancy, try to create a tenant per customer then. Separate web app per customer instead of having multiple web apps in the same app service plan. That's always better. If we take a look at underneath how it is working, so how we are looking at the architecture of web apps on Linux, well, for those who are running traditional web apps, they are still VM-based, the app service. By default, all the apps themselves are running in containers. So even if you don't implement the containers yourself, they're still running in containers, where the older web apps that we are running on Windows are actually still, and you didn't hear this from me, cloud services. It's implementation of cloud services. Worker roles are actually cloud services that they implement, and they provide you the application service pools. That will probably change some point in time, because Microsoft is gradually getting away from cloud services. But there's too much of an impact there, so hence why they still exist. Yeah. But they scale like hell, so there's nothing wrong with it. I'm still a big fan of those. It has endpoints for front-end load balancers, so they have one endpoint, and you only see one endpoint, and you don't have multiple backends to worry about. The service does that for you. There's a runtime database for all your configuration data, which you can talk to the API endpoint, which will integrate with the Kudu interfacing. There's also a local container cache for some writing back stuff, a monitoring service which runs on top of those, and there's always some persistent storage that you need to either run your to either host your containers on, because you need some storage to run those on, and also write back your website data itself, because that will be hosted inside of the storage and it will be hooked there. So it's a little bit kind of the same like the old way, besides that fact that now the workers are really totally segregated in a container, and then you can either run it again as a container or just interface with it to the other ways. Fun thing about the Docker interfacing is that you can bring any other besides the ones that are all supported. So if you really want to run Java, Docker is your friend, right? Just to mention that. Even just like tools that you wouldn't run or couldn't install like that, just doing it through the Docker interface would be the way. I just leave this for your reading. This is normal Docker interfacing, just giving away that you can either use Docker Hub or Azure Container Registry where you can store them, and the rest is for your reading. What you can do for deployment, you can either use FTP, or you can do that through the continuous deployment mechanisms that are already there. That could be GitHub, Container Registry, a private registry, Docker Hub if you're more into the public stuff, or just have a paying account with a private feeds on the Docker Hub, which also exists. And there's also from VSTS a continuous delivery, is still in preview, and that's for most of the web apps still the case, where they have the hook immediately with VSTS. So which one of you are who's using what here? A lot of VSTS people, I think, or more on the side of yeah, of course you. There's always one VSTS MVP in the room, at least one. Any GitHub users here? Private feeds or public feeds? Private. Okay. So in GitHub Enterprise, so it integrates well. So that was one of the first that was fully supported. So they actually put in a lot of effort there. So as you can see, you can go a long way. How does this work? Well, actually, you have a lifecycle which allows you to you just have your normal ALM cycle, and then from a DevOps perspective, you have the pushing through the VSTS with either templating or just some pipelines that you do. You push them back to the Azure Container Registry, for instance, or to the other registries that you have, and from there out, the web app for containers can be pushed to be deployed, and then they can interact with any other kind of service. So for the endpoint perspective of your application, that will still stay the same. If you take a look at it from a larger whole, today we also have, is anybody here using AAZs? So not app service plans, but app service environments? No. So you know that, yeah, I'm sorry, man, that I have to keep running around. He has to move the camera every single time I move it. If you're running AAZs, you can integrate with networking. Yeah? So if you have backend services, you can easily integrate with your backend environment. This is something also that you need to take into account too if you're doing that, because the sorry. Yeah. That's the AAZ series. So if you're doing yeah, but that's a point to site. There's two ways of doing it. Yeah. So you have if you're doing AAZs, you have a multi-tenant and a single tenant isolated version. There's two ways, and one integrates site with immediately in the VNet, and the other one integrates as a point-to-site connection. So he has a gateway which does an ad hoc connection. So it's not always a full, should I put it, full fail-safe connection that you have, because it's forced as a client VPN. Then you would go to the VNet and have peering into your VNet or hook. But that's the backend. Here, if you're doing if you're doing the way you're talking about, or if you're not using ASs, you actually have a web app which is connecting through a client VPN to the gateway of your VNet. Is that the way you do it or not? You're using an ASE. Then you're using an ASE in single tenancy. No, that's not yeah, yeah. If you run it and how much do you pay? Let me put it that way. That would make it easier. If you pay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So if it's the expensive, then you have a full integration inside of your VNet, and the other one is just a connection through a gateway onto the VNet, and then the VNet can be connected again to the backend. The downside is that the connection is always ad hoc. It's just a little bit like a client-side VPN. You connect, you disconnect, you connect, and you disconnect, and that could be troublesome for either your latency or whatever your connectivity. So it's always better if you run a high-load production system. Always better to run it in ASE. Also from a management perspective and from a monitoring perspective of your environment, that's better. Because if you have, let's say you have a full set of web services running on the inside of your environment, and you expose them through, let's say, an API management tooling, but only from the inside, and you don't want to expose them to the outside, and you put an express route in between or a full connected site-to-site environment, then you have the benefit of passing through always through that same gateway, and you immediately integrate with it without doing round trips. So that's just a pro tip I'm giving you. I'm not saying that you have to pay more. I'm just saying that you can have a choice there, but it's always better to do it that way, because the ad hoc connections are not always that stable. And they're hard to troubleshoot. They're very hard to troubleshoot. Although that's could be improved with other tooling in Azure, but that's not the goal of this talk. So I'm sorry that I went into discussion with this gentleman, but it was a serious request. Cool. Okay. So that's but knowing that you have backend services, make sure that if you want to do that, make sure that they're integrated through the means of an AZ, because that way that will make it easier to implement them on that level. Now, let's see, things that could go wrong. They actually depend on other services, SQL, Azure, for instance, storage, networking, cloud services, and that's why I said from a management perspective, your deployment can go wrong. You can have some random bugs in your code. So if it's a container, you just pick up the container and replace it. If you have other issues from a code perspective, that will be harder to debug, but Microsoft is aware of those things. So what can you do to troubleshoot? Well, there's always an SSH access to your endpoint, which you can go to. You can enable diagnostics either in the Docker containers itself and take a look at the Docker logs, but also the server logs that you can have. And there's some just use the best practices that they have to custom Docker images logging. There's some guidelines on the Microsoft side which will explain you how to best improve your logging for those type of instances. Now it would be nice to just take a look what's underneath the hood by just going to the portal and see how the Linux web app environment looks like. So we have our portal here. Let me just make it maybe a little. That's a little bit too much. Is that okay for you guys? Can you see? Right. So we have. I already created an app service plan on Linux. So it's the app service plan, which is your server environment, which will be running the Linux environment. As you can see, there's. If I maybe just zoom in if you look correctly at the icons, I know this is ugly, but if you look good at the icons, there's one icon with a little cloud. I wonder if they're gonna replace it now with the new Azure logo, which is ugly. That's just my opinion. And as you can see, there's a difference between the normal Windows one, and there's a difference between the with the Linux one, because the Linux one has a small penguin. Makes sense, of course, because it runs stocks. Right. And if we then take a look at, just make me, voila, that would be about it. If we then take a look at the machine itself, if we compare it to a normal full Windows and a Linux, we put them side to side, you can see that there's a lot of differences already in tooling available, because here you have this is for the Windows environment. You have all these options, and if we take a look at the Linux environment, there's some options missing immediately. It's especially here in this area. The networking part is not fully integrated yet, but that will come. There's some other stuff here, yeah, that will change. There's also some other stuff here from the automation point of view, and so on and so on. So we then take a look at the apps that are running on it. There's none here. And just deploy one. Seems I didn't. Is there one? No. I thought I deployed one. Oh, anyway, yeah, here, but that's not the correct one. We can just easily deploy one by saying, let's do this. App services. Web app. Here we go. App services. Just gonna add a new one. Microsoft Web App. Create. Demo Linux. Here we go. Use an existing. Luckily, that's already created. We say the Linux, and it will automatically know which ones are running. So this one is okay, and you can choose your runtime stack automatically from there out on which you want to run. Let's just go for a Node.js one, or which is the lightest one to deploy. It could be easily just a .NET Core, and support for more of the .NET Core versions will come, because as you see, it's only 1.1, but 2.0 will come eventually. The upgrading part of web apps is normally every single 2 weeks. They'll take a look at all the patch releases of all the different software platforms and all the frameworks, and this will probably follow in the same cadence as the others. Voila, that's already created. As you can see, it's really fast once the server is already created. If we then take a look at the tooling, immediately you see here that you have an SSH bash shell, but you can also have the kudu tooling. If we compare just close this for a second. Voila. You're probably wondering what is he doing, but I want to just compare side to side the two kudu environments just to show you what the difference is. So if I was to say this one, I need just the URI. I'm lazy. I want to copy. I don't want to type too much. Here we go. You can just click this one. And we're going to go to the Linux one that I just created. Should be here somewhere. Demo Linux. Apparently has type TX instead of TD. It's not too shabby. Up. So if you go to the SCM environments, you will actually see that this one. We put them side to side, you can actually see that there's a difference already in features. Don't let that scare you away. Did I do the same one twice? Yeah, I did the same one twice. Makes sense, of course. Let's try that here again here. Sorry about that. Double clicking actually doesn't work, make it even feel better. There you go. So as you can see, all these tools that you have here, like the site extensions, so they don't work there. Why? Because they're based on IIS technology and not on the underlying web server technology that is being used here. Also, taking a look at the app settings. No, that's not the thing that I wanted to say. Taking a look at the source control. No, where's the? Yeah, that doesn't have that. There's no full runtime versions or feedback that you have here yet, but you do have a bash shell, which is on par mostly with the command line, but you don't have the browsing interface experience that you have here. So if I were to say I click on this element here, this directory here, it will automatically move on forward here, but you don't see that here, so you don't have that convenience here. But then again, in the Linux world, we don't have graphical user interfaces. Now, and for anything else, you can see if we do PS, for instance, here, you can see that the services that are running, it's bash. There's Apache running on the background. If we do get process, or just go for the PowerShell environment, and I do a git process here, you can actually see that this is truly a Windows environment, because normally you will see here the, well, here we are, W3WP, which is the process for running IIS. So, and for us, everything else stays the same. Same deployment path, same way of handling things. As you can see here, we have the Docker container environment that you can run, where you can say, I want to have a container now in 1.1. You can have a startup file which will automatically configure your containers to your needs by pushing some things on getting some deployments back. And just save that, and then the new container will be, or the image will be updated for you. Okay, so in the future, coming, all the pushing will be from container registries could be done from here too, just creating new containers. You have the deployment options, up, where you can have a source, and you can actually choose from, just like you would have in the other environments, GitHub, Bitbucket, and Atlassian. Oh, let's see that I'm actually going over my time. So I need to make sure that I hurry up a little bit. Yeah, it's already, still got 5 minutes to go, so I'm sorry about that. Still, you also have the features of deployment slots, so nothing changes there, so you can easily implement the same A/B testing experience that you have in normal web apps, and so on and so on and so on. And the continuous delivery part is where you can actually start configuring the entire DevOps structure that you can have. And if you configure this, we actually see that for now it's just team services, but this will also follow with other out-of-the-box experiences. Taking a look at the full DevOps environment from a Azure perspective, we have today the standard, let's say, way of working, which we know from all these other words, but we have a larger ecosystem because there's too many tools and too many clients and other things that you can use from an open source perspective, because most of the tools don't work together that well with a full Windows environment. There's Jenkins full support, Grunt, Ansible, you name it, there's support for that, and they can also manage your infrastructure as code. Back to the processing tools that you can have, like Jira and Redmine, which is less used. I think most of the people here use the Atlassian suite anyway, which is far superior to anything else. From a monitoring perspective, you also have the Nagios and the Zabbix thing. Now, does it have to be that? No, because most of the tooling that we have in Azure also supports the OMS from a Linux perspective. So there will be full support for monitoring web apps through OMS in the Linux part too, because the agents will be the same. All these things can come back there. If you take a look at the specifics, there's some guidelines on the Azure websites showing you what kind of end-to-end open source pipelines you can have. There's, for instance, the GitHub and then build through Jenkins and then push it back to the things like the Azure Container Registry, and with Spinnaker and Azure Container Service, you can actually build up your containers, for instance, or you can just use GitHub, push it back to Jenkins, make it sure that it gets being able to find your environment back on some Azure storage, for instance, and then through the continuous delivery pipeline from Jenkins tooling, push it back to the Azure web app. There will be, however, they're working on something which allows you to deploy this kind of a pipeline from an ARM template too. So for today we only have an ARM template for Jenkins, but there will be a full DevOps pipeline availability by the means of a default standard architecture by Microsoft itself. Another example where you can either bake your VHD or do a container registry and push back to VMM scale sets, for instance, if you're running Linux VMs, if you want more granular control on your environment. So there's also capabilities there. That's not forgotten, right? Another way of looking at things, if you really want to go full non-Microsoft on the tooling part, you can go with again the Jenkins, and Jenkins is actually the most favorable, because those guys also give from a plugin perspective. I think there's like 10 plugins in Jenkins where you can actually hook up to Azure resources. So there's a lot of things going on there. As you can see here, but the thing that I want to mention here is that there's also full support of Elk. So if you're doing monitoring with Elasticsearch, Logstash, and Kibana, you can actually build pretty nice dashboards from that monitoring perspective. I leave this for you reading what all the products are, but there's a full solution template every single time built based on these slides, so just click through them. The slides will be made available after the talk. There's one thing that I still want to mention is the Terraform thing. Who hasn't heard about Terraform? Everybody has? Oh, okay. So Terraform is, ARM templates. Yeah? What you typically do is you do a definition of your environment, but they're very hard to read, especially from a non-developer perspective, because most, and forgive me the expression, but most IT pros are not accustomed to JSON formatting. They cannot read that well. And actually, to be honest, I find the ARM template very exhaustive when you need to write them out, because there's no good IntelliSense, there's no good auto lookup, there's no good guidance on how to inject all these pieces, although some of the interfaces that we have in Visual Studio Code can help you, but it's not quite the same. Now Terraform, actually, what that does is it has providers also, but it can even go multi-cloud. And that's where the beauty is. So if you ever want to set up an environment, let's say one in Azure, and you want to recreate the same environment also in AWS, just to make sure that you're multi-cloud fault resilient, because nobody says that either Amazon will not be available or either Azure will not be available. You want to make sure that you're fault resilient, and this is one of the ways you can do that. Now this Terraform thing is actually pretty easy. It's just one XA that you need to download from the terraform.io site, and even from a portal perspective, it's already foreseen. So if I open up the bash shell from, so for those who have never seen this before, if you open up the bash shell or even a PowerShell environment, because it can actually support both environments. Okay, I'm finishing up here, so I'm already 1 minute over time, so give me 2 more seconds. it will connect to a Docker container for you guys, and where you can actually run all the Azure client environment capabilities. Like if I were to say here AZ, I need to type in there. I will actually get all the client tools that you know from a command line perspective, as you can see here. But I can also do this. So Terraform data. Oh no, I need to type in there. Come on. Terraform. Well, and that's immediately supported. So if you were to say I have a Terraform file, I can upload it, and these Terraform files, they look something like this. I have one here. I should have one here. Where did I do it? File recent. Come on. Open recent. Was it here? Yeah, here it is. If you take a look at the Terraform files, I'm not gonna run it because it's you need something like a resource. Just go away here. Yeah. You need something like resource providers, in this case the RM providers, and then just start defining the resources. In this case, I will create a resource group, a virtual network, a subnet in that virtual network, and as you can see, they just bounce through from one to the other just by adding the same code names here. So this is the resource group. This redefines to this one, and you can just point to the properties of that. So it's a little bit more readable than an ARM template. But this can, just by changing the providers, you can actually just easily switch to another environment. And you can multi-deploy from a DevOps perspective there too. So that's pretty neat. And if I were to run this, this will actually create me a virtual machine from the environment. So if I were to say here, where is it in my terminal? Where was that file? Based again, I need to source control. So C. Source control GitHub. No, GitHub and Terraform. And I were to say Terraform and then plan. It will actually start looking for calculating the plan and trying to see whether it can deploy, and it will actually verify your file, and then just all you need to do is Terraform deploy, and it will deploy. Now this one has a bug in there. Right before my PC crashed for some stupid reason, and I forgot to type in somewhere, so I didn't have time to check it out why it failed. But for some reason it seems okay now, so I'm not gonna touch that. Well, again, some other toolings that you can take a look at. That's basically it that I wanted to say. I have some references for you. There's some good things that you can take a look at, some good links that you can use on all the levels of open source integrations in the Azure platform. There's only one thing that I still need to do, and is just say thank you. It has been an exhausting 2 days for me. I hope for you guys too, of all the content that you got into your heads, and that you go home fresh with some new ideas. Still feel free to pester me with any questions you have regarding Azure. I will be here on the floor for the rest of the day, and I hope you enjoy your weekend, and I hope you enjoy TechDays. Thank you.